Okay, I think we're going to get started. It's a little bit after 1:30 and we have quite a few of the participants who have registered on right now. So we'll get rolling. Thanks for everyone taking the time today to be here. It's a rainy day here in Halifax. I don't know what it's like in the rest of the Atlantic provinces, but I know here it's rainy. So we're glad to be here with Danny Graham. So I'm Marcus Jamieson. I'm the MentorAbility Atlantic Regional Coordinator for Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And Ashley Hammond, my co-host, is a MentorAbility Atlantic Regional Coordinator for Newfoundland and PEI. And again, we're really excited to hear Danny speak on how we can foster a more inclusive society for us all. But before we get started, I just wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping items. For anyone that doesn't know, MentorAbility is a national supported employment initiative that provides opportunities and education and awareness to be shared between employers and people experiencing a disability in communities across Canada. So like I said before, Ashley and I are the Atlantic coordinators for here in Atlantic Canada. And we look forward to following up with you all in the future and collaborating. So feel free to use the Q&A or the chat boxes as we go along. If you have any technical issues, you can't hear or something goes wrong, please let us know and we'll do what we can from our end. This is all relatively new to us as well, but we will try to assist you as best we can. If you have a question, just like I say, use the chat box or the Q&A. Feel free to use your mic. If you want, you can put your hand up and you can ask a question, and we'll keep an eye on it all. And we encourage people to ask questions and to make comments. So as Danny's going along, we will keep an eye on what's being said and we will pass that along if he doesn't see it. So any questions or comments are welcome. And just a quick plug for next week, we have Mark Wafer, who is going to talk about the business case for real inclusion. So we're really excited about that, and that's next Thursday at the same time. So, like I said, we are super excited to have Danny here today with us. He has, over a 30-year period, he has held senior positions in business, law, government, and politics. He is currently the Chief Engagement Officer for Engage Nova Scotia, an independent nonprofit that invites Nova Scotians to be collaborative, inclusive, and adaptive to change. Engage Nova Scotia, leading to the Nova Scotia Quality of Life Initiative. So enough from me, and over to you, Danny.
Thanks very much, Marcus, and thanks to everyone for their interest in me participating in this discussion. I want to say at the outset that I think the greatest value that will come from this will be in the, perhaps not so much in the first half hour, but in the discussions that we have about the topics that I'm raising in the remainder. And I look very much forward to learning from everyone about the work that you're all doing collectively. I'll keep an eye on the slide on the chat box to the side to make sure that I'm not missing anything significant. I want to acknowledge that I'm not a subject specialist with respect to issues related to disabilities, except to the extent that I've been fortunate to have one of my children who's both on the autistic spectrum and has Down syndrome as someone who frankly has been my greatest teacher and someone who has slowed me down, opened my mind, and softened my heart for 29, almost 30 years. So in that regard, advocacy in relation to the issues that are near and dear to you is something that my family and I have been closely associated with, and I wish you all the wind in your sails that you need to sort of do things that will help create a more inclusive society generally. From time to time, I've been asked to speak on questions of disabilities, largely because of my in my role as a father and as an advocate. But I'm going to be wearing a slightly different hat for most of the presentation that I'm going to be sharing with you today. It's going to touch on my role with Engage Nova Scotia and the work we're trying to do in this province. I recognize that I'm on our call today are people from all 4 Atlantic provinces, and I welcome the opportunity afterward to share some more, if you like, about the specifics of what you're doing and for what we're doing and how it might be of relevance to you. And for that reason, on the cover that you see before you, I have my email address, and don't hesitate to send me an email if you have any questions or if you want any follow-up. So with that, maybe I'll just sort of launch in. So our organization, Engage Nova Scotia, is a non-for-profit. We have, oh, I'm reminded, Ashley, as you move into those slides, and if you could just pause there for a quick moment, I'll be asking someone to advance the slides periodically as we move along. So our organization is a non-for-profit that likes to think of ourselves as sitting at the intersection between the public, the private, the community, and the academic sectors. And in that regard, while we're an NGO, we sort of have a unique position in that we're calling Nova Scotians to ignite a culture of civic engagement around the deeper questions that have held us back and sort of accelerate our potential as a people. And when I used to say this 8 years ago, when we started the organization, it all sounded really esoteric, I think, to people. Hopefully the work that we're describing for you specifically gives you a clearer sense of the path that we've been taking and work that we think is quite important. For many years as Atlantic Canadians, we've been struggling with this question about whether we belong or whether we're trailing. And often when we think of the ways in which we've been trailing other parts of North America and Canada, we speak in economic terms, and we recognize that our economic health has not been as strong as other parts of the country or the continent for that matter. But we wanted to better understand, as a starting point, what really matters to Nova Scotians. So a few years back, we conducted a survey of 1,000 Nova Scotians, and we asked them a question that we don't think has been asked on any other occasion. You see it on the screen that I've presented to you before already, and it was essentially about how should we measure success. And on a scale of 1 to 10, when we got our responses back, it kind of surprised those people who read it. You'll see from what's indicated here, those who answered at 7, 8, 9, or 10 on a scale of 1 to 10, it signaled that growing the economy was a priority. And in a separate question, because these aren't issues that are in competition with each other, they're actually just 2 isolated questions, we replaced outgrowing the economy with improving our quality of life. And as you can see in the response that we got from Nova Scotians, this notion of improving our quality of life is something that resonated at a higher level. And when we looked to disaggregate that data by region of the province, whether there are differences or gender, age, income, education, in all categories that we slice this through, it was clear that this notion of quality of life is something that is, in a sense, a higher North Star for us. I'd be interested in seeing the extent to which this would differ from the responses that we would get in other Atlantic provinces. My guess would be that it wouldn't be particularly different. And in fact, and this to the point of what I'd like to share with you near the end of my presentation, more than ever, I am expecting that this notion of improving our quality of life is coming into focus for people. The challenge, however, is that we don't have many ways of measuring quality of life. And so what often ends up being a proxy for whether we're doing well as a society is whether we see the economy rising, GDP growing. And so everyone expects that GDP rising means that everything's going well, without recognizing, as the United Kingdom recently started to include in their calculations, that the black market, the drug trade, prostitution, natural disasters are all things that actually grow the economy, and they calculate in their GDP growth equations without realizing that in fact that doesn't improve people's lives. So in search of answers to questions about what's the relationship between the economy and people's life satisfaction or quality of life, we went in search of international data. Next slide, please, Ashley. And we came across something that actually shows at first a very strong correlation between economic well-being and people's personal well-being. This is an indication of how people are expressing their life satisfaction in the much talked about United Nations World Happiness Report. You'll see that the 10 countries that are in the left-hand column are clearly from more advanced economies relative to the ones on the right-hand side. So clearly there is a strong correlation at a global level between wealth, if you will, economic wealth, and happiness. But if you go to the next slide, Ashley, you'll see that something interesting begins to happen when you have, in a sense, enough money. This is from the same year, drawing a correlation between those top 10 countries where we have life satisfaction. This is the same chart on the left-hand side that you would have seen on the previous slide. But when you look at which of the, amongst advanced economies, which are the ones that have inclusive economies, and by that it means those ones that ensure that fewer people demonstrably are falling between the cracks, have more opportunities to realize their full potential. You see that, and that right-hand column was actually created through economists at the World Economic Forum. We see that there's actually a high correlation between those countries that are looking to include everyone and make sure fewer people fall between the cracks, and those that have the highest life satisfaction. So this we thought was a particularly interesting thing to sort of incorporate into how we're imagining our lives to be here in little old Nova Scotia. So in collaboration with an organization out of Waterloo called the Canadian Index of Wellbeing, along with many, many partners. You'll see more about them in my latter slides, but in particular, Nova Scotia Community College was a key partner for us. Last year, we launched the most ambitious of its kind survey on people's quality of life. So to next slide, please, Ashley. We sent out a survey of 230 questions to Nova Scotians in a randomly selected mailing group. And we said, if you believe in this place, we'd like you to participate in this survey. Because there were 230 questions, we were warned by pollsters that we might only get, we might get less than a 2% response rate because it would require too much of people's time and commitment. To our delight, we got a 16% response rate to our question, resulting in 12,827 survey responses to those 230 indicators, making it the largest data set on quality of life that exists in North America. Now, this was achieved substantially as a result of the support of local leadership teams in different regions of the province. So to the Nova Scotians who are part of the call, if you're interested in becoming a part of what's happening in your local regions of the province, please feel free to email me and I can tell you about the work that's happening through local leadership teams to make this all a greater reality. To next slide, please, Ashley. You might be asking yourself, well, what kinds of questions were being asked of in those 230 indicators? This slide will give you a sense of what just a small slice, tip of the iceberg of the kinds of questions we were asking, the themes that we were touching on that we think relate to things that people value and matter to them. So it could be the fairly general, and some might think philosophical questions about life satisfaction more generally, to how people are doing with their mental health, and of course all the way down to and including concrete issues about their access to libraries or internet service or recreation facilities and parks and so on. Our questions, and I'm going to touch on this a little bit, also include a substantial series of questions about people's employment circumstances. And given the themes of the talks that you've had, I'm going to touch a little bit more on the questions that we're pointing to with respect to employment, work satisfaction, and underemployment. And I also want to touch a little bit on what we learned about discrimination, the way to slice and dice this. You'll see from the bullet near the bottom that there's a pretty robust demographic set of questions that allows for us to disaggregate the information that we've received based on people's age, gender, ethnicity, living circumstances, income, and region. We are just now receiving back the more fully digested analysis related to all of this work, and it's pointing us in some directions that I'll share with you, but I'll point to one that has more recently become important to us, and that is that when we, as we look at the communities of people who are trailing or struggling, single parents are really finding it difficult. And as we emerge through the COVID experience, single parents, I think, will continue to have a significant challenge as they think about getting their kids off to school, finding work or childcare or something of that nature. I want to speak about the efforts that we made with communities of people to ensure that often underrepresented communities, like those in different communities who have disabilities of one sort or another, were made aware of this, and that we had a response rate that reflected the community more generally. We're encouraged that according to the signals we've gotten back from Statistics Canada, the people who in their records report having a chronic illness or a disability have seem proportionately represented in the responses that we've received. So that's an encouraging result, and we're glad that those communities we're continuing to pay attention to where we're going. And maybe I'll just touch on a few results that actually have emerged in that regard. Ashley, if you could just go to the next slide again, please. So I mentioned in those indicators that one of our questions relates to discrimination. The size of our response is high enough that we can disaggregate things by regions of the province. And there's not a substantial difference from one region to the other to this particular question. It's one of the 230 questions that we put out to people, and it was essentially along the lines of, on a scale of 1 to 7, with 1 being never and 7 being all the time, what has been your experience of discrimination? And you'll see that across the province overall, in the sort of lower left side of this quadrant, 84% responded with a never, which meant, of course, that based on disability, there's a full 15% or so of Nova Scotians who, of course, experience that. Now, I'm not sure how that jives with your personal experiences, and or whether that rubs up against contrary data. All we can say is that it's, we've gotten a strong and representative response from people who say that they have some form of disability, and across each region of the province, this has been their response rate. So we took that a little bit further, and then we, to the next slide, please, Ashley. And we asked the question about discrimination in a variety of different ways. You'll see that it focused on age, gender, disability, ethnicity, religion, or sexual orientation. And you'll see that the issue of disability comes out third amongst within the frequency with which people are describing experiencing discrimination. That's across the province as a whole, and you'll see based on the way that this particular grid reads, is that that's a fairly consistent experience for people in all different regions of the province when you rank them relative to those other forms of potential discrimination. To the next slide, please, Ashley. So we don't have time to go into all of the kinds of questions that are included in the 230, but I thought I would take a screenshot of an example of the kinds of questions that we have asked that are relevant to you who are gathered for this when you focus on the issues about employability and disadvantages that occur in the workplace for people with disabilities. And you'll see the various questions that we have for each one of these 7 questions that are listed on the left-hand margin. We have separate charts that will describe what people's experience is in this. And with the raw data, and there's some potential for us to make available the raw data for analysis, we'd be able to do a comparison of the experience of people with a disability and chronic illness relative to the overall responses for every one of these questions. So from our perspective, over a long period of time, this has the potential to give us a significant body of new information that we didn't have across every one of the 230 questions that I spoke about before. Ashley, if you could flip to the next slide, please. And it points us in the direction of something that you know, and I think we've all known, those of us who've paid attention to these issues for a long period of time, and that is that there are so many systemic inequalities that exist for people who are looking to realize their potential if they have a disability. And I mentioned in an earlier slide that they're within the 230 questions, they are grouped into roughly 8 categories. And time doesn't allow for me to go into each component of this, but you can imagine the kinds of questions that we would ask about people's health, access to health care, all the things that drive their health, whether or not they have opportunities for better education, whether their work-life balance is in order, whether they have enough time or feel time stressed to do the things that exist in their lives. And so that's sort of the broad context for this. And this graph is intended to show that I hope you can see it, the dotted blue line that's sort of in the inner part of that circle, that's an irregularly shaped something, is the response rate for people who identify as having a disability or chronic illness. And you can see from this response that in every one of the 8 categories that we express, including people's expression of overall well-being, people who report having a disability or chronic illness are reporting experiences that are below the provincial average here in Nova Scotia. So we hope that this becomes, over time, a resource to raise awareness for people about the significant disadvantages that continue to exist systemically for the community of people that you and we want to represent. Next slide, please, Ashley. This is a many years, many analysis, many partners, many activities sort of action that ultimately takes us back to this question about what's a good life and how do we sort of begin to express the full extent of what's important for us as individuals and as collections. And I want you to think back to those early slides that I showed about those jurisdictions that amongst advanced economies that frankly have enough. It is those that sort of make sure that fewer people are falling between the cracks that are the ones where life satisfaction actually goes higher. So the point behind that is that regardless of the socioeconomic status that somebody might have, it's in everyone's best interest to have an inclusive society and an inclusive economy. the research, and I don't have slides that give you all the details about this, but they're not particularly pretty for those countries. One notable one south of the border, where it seems that the narrative about where they want to go is almost exclusively about growing the economy as fast and as hot as it could possibly be. And while that may, in fact, signal successes for some, life happiness, resilience, longevity of life, and other issues in that country uniquely are going in the wrong direction. So from our perspective, this is an important issue in isolation about who's being affected. But I hope we don't lose the forest for the trees when we look at all the ways in which different populations are being left behind, and that we increasingly emphasize in the conversations that we have with policy leaders and others that it's in everyone's best interest that fewer people are being left behind. So the next wave of work that we're going to be looking to sort of bring to the consciousness of those who are willing and ready, able to listen, we'll focus on issues of poverty, who's experiencing it and why, discrimination, health issues, social isolation, community vitality and trust. Some of these issues, the last three in particular, don't have a home the way that housing does or what poverty does, for example. And this is part of the reason for us wanting to sort of draw people's attention to the importance of social cohesion and solid relationships to people's life satisfaction. Just the beginning of where we go from there. Just going to something that popped in on the chat line from Shelley Andrews. If the stats show the value for inclusiveness, then why is it so technical to get continued traction in communities? How is it difficult? Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that this isn't visible to people. First of all, that slide about the importance and to the theme of what I want to point to, Ashley, if you can go to the next slide, is that life is what we're realizing through research more than ever is that life is a team game. That if we live in a society that doesn't ensure that everyone, that there was an old expression about growing the economy that rising tides lifts all boats. And that was repeated in the Maritimes and Atlantic Canada more often than perhaps any place. But it frankly, I think has been debunked in more recent research about what's making for successful societies. That you need to be intentional about what it is that you're trying to do. And part of that involves bringing people the kind of information that ensures that everybody sees, oh, this is in it's in everyone's best interest to sort of work together. So as a person with privilege or opportunity that others don't have, my well-being and life satisfaction is dependent on ensuring that we work on this, we work toward this in a collective way. And I think I'll just end with this as a theme and open it up for discussion for you. And that is that this historic time that we have experienced over the last 4 months has been excruciating for so many people. Obviously, those who have experienced the loss of loved ones, those who have felt uncertainty, those who have lost life savings after building up small businesses for a long period of time and have seen their customers disappear. In the not-for-profit sector, things are changing dramatically. And in personal lives, it feels like this has been a time of real reflection. And the reflections that I think are emerging for people relate to this general notion of what matters most. And like what I said about Patrick in the earlier, my son Patrick, about the blessing that he has brought to my life, he has fundamentally slowed me down and opened my mind and softened my heart. And my belief is that in some fashion, without trying to sound too Pollyanna about what this time has brought, I believe that this represents an unprecedented historic opportunity for us to recognize that in getting through this, those societies that have succeeded are the ones that pulled together. And it was often the people with a lower socioeconomic status that cleaned the washrooms, that showed up at the grocery stores to do the things, that provided the delivery at our doors, that have provided the backbone for our society. So with the visibility, with the level of reflection that we have been in over this period of time, that I think is quite real, and the opportunity for us to sort of reimagine what a future looks like, I can't help but think that we need to draw on the power of what we've just experienced and be reminded that we're all in this together. And that's a cliche by this time, but truly we are. And life as a team game was this concept that came to me the most. And we're seeing who has been most affected by the experience of COVID. It has been populations of people who have been on the margins for some period of time. As we rebuild, we can't reimagine and rebuild a society without ensuring that the people who have been most affected and the people who have been the backbone in our most difficult times are in the conversation, and making sure that we are building back in an inclusive way if we want an inclusive society. So we see some of the organizing around that with respect to marginalized communities of people, but I would plead with those of us who live professionally or personally in a world where we want very much for a greater recognition of the opportunity and the challenges of people living with disabilities to be more a focus and more, again, an opportunity for us all to live a better life, to be in the conversations and to be as tenacious as we can, in a sense, get our elbows up and say that we belong. I have some thoughts about how the various communities of us have been organizing around disabilities and the need for us to have a more cohesive sort of expression of our circumstances. But you know more about that than I do, so I won't try to pontificate too much about this as a particular point at this stage. So we could fall back to the way that things were. We could make it even worse than they were before, or we could imagine a future where we're linked arms and we see the potential and the benefit and the richness that comes from the first calling about sort of living in harmony with each other, that is, I think, in this region of the world, preciously still preserved and not far from the surface. It doesn't express itself all the time, but we do live in a place with unique potential and a sense of community, demonstrably a sense of community that I think could be a model for other places to join in with. So those are that's the overview of my reflections, and I look very much forward to the conversation that ensues.
Danny, there was a comment from Shelley again, and Shelley lives in Newfoundland. It is interesting that you say that when our government left out this population up until a few days ago.
Sorry, I probably misspoke myself in relation to that, Shelley. What I meant to say in that is that that people who have been underrepresented have been less visible to governments, racialized communities, people with lower incomes, Indigenous communities, and people with disabilities. And it feels like until this last time, when some went on pause others have continued. And what I'm hearing from government officials, at least in Nova Scotia, and federal officials saying, whether this is the way it's going to play out, I'm not sure, is that, boy, was that a wake-up call about the importance of us having a more inclusive society. So I think the seeds are there. I was in a conversation with deputy ministers on Monday here in Nova Scotia who are trying to reimagine how to build back better, as they call it, here in Nova Scotia. And this very much is something that's caught their attention and is a focus going forward.
If you have any questions or comments, please write them in, or feel free to turn your mic on and say something. Oh, Shelley has another comment. Thank you, Shelley. It is interesting. Sorry, is it the same thing? Nope. If the stats show the value of inclusiveness, nope. Sorry, I'm getting confused. Oh, she just wrote thanks, Danny. She just added, oh, thanks, Shelley. But I had a quick question just about us working. Like, we have service providers on the call, we have family on the call, we have and employers on the call, and we're all in this together, right? This isn't something that just one of us has to go off and do. And I think sometimes it's a challenge for us all to be working together cohesively, and so that we're all not working, as I told you earlier this week, in silos. You know, if I have somebody who is looking for work but has transportation challenges, I have to work with maybe another service provider or someone else to make that happen. If someone has housing issues, it's going to be hard maybe to look for work. A single parent has maybe it could have childcare, and it may be out of my scope to provide that support in that moment. But there's service providers, there's organizations that could be out there that could provide that support that we could be working together on. Do you have any insights or any comments on how us as a system, as a society, could work better together?
So I don't know the circumstances in the other three Atlantic provinces. And even within Nova Scotia, I've been involved in some early stage discussions about how a coalition could become more focused on the collective issues, and employment being one of the most important organizing issues for communities of people with disabilities. So I think a great deal more work needs to be done, and I know that there's a complexity to that, and everyone's sort of trying to sort of work with the crumbs that they've been given or they've raised to sort of realize their own potential. So this is, I'm going to speak in a way that reflects an impracticality to some of this, but also a hope. The impracticality is that is that everyone's like families are working in urgent circumstances. So trying to lift your head long enough to get a gaze on something where you're going to tenaciously and strategically advance a shared agenda around issues of disability is simply not easy. The early seeds of that have been happening in Nova Scotia. I've been encouraged to see. And about 2 years ago, the communities came together around some legislation in Nova Scotia that was a bit unprecedented, and frankly resulted in all three major political parties in the legislature agreeing on a direction. It's an incremental gain, but I think this is the time for us to raise our voices. And as we do, it would be, setting the foundation around what are the achievable things to do over the short, medium, and longer term, if we could be really strategic about how we work together. And on that vein, I'll just say parenthetically that everyone's having to rethink how they work. Private sector, public sector, academic, municipalities, they're all having to rethink it. So this represents an opportunity for everyone to rethink this and to get out of our silos and to work more collaboratively, including the silos that exist within the disabilities communities. And if and as we move in this direction, we can join forces with communities of people who are also fighting for inclusion by reason of income, housing, race, language, and so on, to point to that broader notion that there's a lens, so that we're not all getting picked off because, well, it's the disabilities community that the community services department has to deal with here. Oh, it's housing now that needs to be dealt with. Oh, there's this health and education issue, and everything becomes piecemeal. What I would invite us to do is imagine whether we go back to a lens and a perspective, and we reinforce as often as we can that life's about more than dollars and cents, that it's a team game. And that slide that I showed you above about the relationship, and there's an important relationship between the economy and quality of life, let's start to make sure that that big lens about well-being, life satisfaction, quality of life gets repeated in the language that we use as an organization, not just to sort of get to our tactical advantages, but reinforce to opinion leaders and those with larger purses than your organizations often have, the importance of putting a new lens on things more generally. And that's part of what we're fighting for. We're a 6-person small NGO trying to sort of catalyze a lot of activity related to different populations, but overall our responsibility is to say, let's just take a breath. And this feels like, more than any time in my life, an opportunity to take that breath and reinforce the notion of quality of life.
Danny, there's a question from Leslie. The recognition that we are all valuable to our society and the well-being of our communities will continue to remain a challenge when supports remain disproportionately focused on individuals with strong transferable skills. We have a dynamic, untapped labor force that government and industry fail to recognize. Engaging this untapped labor force will improve overall quality of life, economic stability, and resiliency.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And so that's not well known. Let me just share with you a perspective about this. We have underrepresented populations that are visibly wanting to make their case, and we are going to be working with them, and we'll work with anyone who wants to use the information that is contained in our research to advance their causes. Some of those populations of people come from a proportion of the overall population that's less than 5% of it. You know, and we know that the proportion of people with disabilities is way higher than many of those. So I think the strength and power of using the information to point to just how many people are experiencing some disability in their life is critically important, and continue to amplify those opportunities as much as possible will be critical. We still do live in a squeaky wheel society, and I don't mean that in a way that's not intended to be supportive for other communities of people who are fighting. And I know how hard, you know, I've been in this for all of Patrick's life, for example, in one fashion or another, and joining boards and working with organizations to try to advance this. I know it's not easy, but this feels like it's the time to sort of pull it up. And that unequal resourcing, it's a critical issue. I'm quite aware of the underemployment and the unemployment issues with respect to people with disabilities. It's frightening. We just need our voices to be amplified in some fashion. So you know this work better than I do.
There's a couple more comments. Morag said, I agree with your question, Marcus, and I feel the location urban versus rural is another challenge. So the kind of, the challenges could be different in a urban area where there could be more resources, could be more opportunities than it could be in rural. Transportation could be a difference in there as far as challenges and stuff. So that's another comment. Did anything jump out at you, Danny, as far as the results from your survey and the work that you guys did? Big differences between the rural and the urban areas, like cities, the larger towns and smaller areas. Was there any kind of stark difference? Were you able to get that kind of data from the results?
Yeah, some of that appears, and some of it is well known in the literature about when one looks at the difference in perspectives and values, and you slice it up, there frankly, especially in political terms, there are strong differences relatively strong differences between rural and urban perspectives. A lot has been written about that generally. As it relates to life satisfaction at a global level, and we actually have research that reflects this in Nova Scotia that we did before we did the survey. We tested this question that, in fact, by the UN standard that I talked about in the early stages about life satisfaction, there is a rural-urban divide, and the places where life satisfaction is highest is overwhelmingly in rural communities relative to urban communities. For those of you in cities, let me say something more about that, is that in general in Canada, as you move from west to east, people have higher life satisfaction. When you move from urban to rural communities, people generally, not always, have higher life satisfaction. That doesn't answer the question about what's the better place to live, but I think it's an interesting question and point, because we know that access to built environments are, for example, more challenged in rural environments than they are in others. We're in Nova Scotia, the early look at the 13,000 survey responses that we have suggest that, perhaps not surprisingly, that in HRM, the Halifax Regional Municipality, they have fewer financial insecurities than they do in other parts of the province. But the sense of community vitality and social cohesion is lower in those places. So there are many variables that go into life satisfaction and quality of life, but there are some interesting ones that one can pay attention to. I should say that the results that I'm pointing to are captured in table form on our website. If you want to go to engagenovascotia.ca, you can learn all about this, including reading various reports that we have done on topics of this nature. So engagenovascotia.ca, just go to the quality of life material, and you'll see what's been written so far, and there are going to continue to be waves in this regard.
A couple more comments and questions, Danny. This is from Steve in Halifax. It seems to me that a blessing, if we can call it that, brought in by the pandemic is that most people have been paying attention. The mistreatment of vulnerable seniors and the illegal and violent mistreatment of Indigenous people and people of color has been going on for a very long time, but most people never noticed. It's inspiring that the pandemic slowed people down to the point that people are paying attention and most people are outraged. This speaks to the inherent goodness of most people. Regarding disability, the same would likely happen if the majority of people became aware of the realities, the unemployment rates, the rates of poverty, and the success stories as well. Things would likely improve with the increased awareness, and again, it speaks to the goodness of people. I would agree.
Agreed.
Yes.
Yeah. Full stop. I think what we're seeing with some of this is that as we slow down, our ability to be empathetic, not sentimental, but just truly empathetic, that we understand somebody else's story is improved. And I think that's a lot of what Steve is pointing to, that it's happening now, and it does create this opportunity for greater inclusion.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. From Leslie, how do we help change the mindset of government and industry that alternative learning and skill development programs are equal partners in workplace development? Many are equipped to train for positions. Industry seems lackluster when it comes to collaboration and partnership.
Oh, I think that there are people, Leslie, on the call who would have a richer perspective on that than I would, because they're more immersed in these kinds of questions. So not that I don't have a perspective about this, I just want to make sure that I'm not offering you more than you'll get much value for, and others who might join the chat box would be able to have some rich insights on this as well. So not to duck it, just want to recognize what I have good information or solid perspectives on.
So if anybody has anything they'd like to say to that question by Leslie, but just to get back to something that Steve had said that I think is related to Leslie's comment in question was Stephen said, to show success stories. And I think that is part of it is, I know when I and others in the industry go to talk to employers and government, it's good to bring the stats and the outcomes and the realities and to show the success through numbers, but it's also good to talk about the stories and relate to people that way. So it's not always less transactional, like here's the numbers, this is what I did, this is the outcomes. We're working with real people. There's real people in the community that need help and that are suffering, and that shouldn't be lost. And I know when I and others talk to employers or government, we tell a story, a success, or maybe just even a story. It doesn't have to be a success story, but it's a story of a real person in the community or a real family. That often has the biggest impact. That's what people look up from the paper and start shaking their head, and you get an emotional reaction. So I think that's one piece of it. Ashley's asked, has your organization considered partnering with similar firms in other provinces in Atlantic Canada to eventually extend a study to the other 3 provinces? I think the results would likely be similar, but it would be extremely interesting and beneficial on an Atlantic Canada scale to have data like that across Atlantic Canada. Oh, sorry, that's
happy to chew on that a little bit. I think there is emerging interest in different Atlantic provinces. I did a podcast a couple of weeks ago out of New Brunswick about this particular work. I spoke at the launch in Prince Edward Island of the Vital Signs work that's being done through the Prince Edward Island Community Foundation. Nationally, I've been quite recently in a number of conversations with, believe it or not, the Department of Finance and a new portfolio that was recently established in the federal government, which doesn't have a particularly compelling name about middle class prosperity or something like that. But the mandate letter that was given to the new minister in that role, and it's connected to finance, is closely related to trying to do the kinds of things that we're pointing to and establish a national framework for doing this in some fashion. Not easy to govern, even for our regions, and we need to do a better job. Forget what people say about governments collaborating. As organizations, frankly, my experience, having worked in public policy for decades, is that we don't do a good enough job as Atlantic Canadians of figuring out how we can link arms and do better. Some sectors obviously do a little better than others. I would point to some jurisdictions that are of a similar size to Atlantic Canada, like New Zealand and Scotland. They're a little bit bigger. They have about 5 million people. We would have about 3 maybe. I'm calculating correctly for our region, maybe a little less than that. But I think we are ideally suited, for some of the reasons that I said earlier, to get ahead of this. Because again, we haven't lost our sense of decency. And, you know, the things that Steve was talking about earlier about, you know, that basic goodness. I think that there's something in our DNA that recognizes that as alluring as it might be, the good life isn't necessarily on Bay Street. It exists in the quality of the relationships that we have with people, and we're a place where we're an example to other parts of the world about not being seduced by something shiny somewhere else. So I'd love to explore the idea about how this would do. The complexity of what we're doing is fairly significant. Actually, if you just go to the next couple of slides, if you don't mind, you'll see that in building this out, we've got a long roster of community partners. So we're an NGO ourselves, and we've been relying on these kinds of organizations and municipalities, and the ones that are on the next slide, if you can switch that over to the next one, that demonstrate that, you know, these are all municipalities and organizations and chambers of commerce that say this work is important. And for that matter, if any of your organizations are looking to become identified with the work that we're doing, we would welcome having you signal your support for this work overall. That's not a pitch so much as it's just an open invitation to anybody who believes in the things that we're trying to do. So we're in the early stages. We're past a startup, but we're still an early stage initiative that will take some time to sort of demonstrate that we've got a proof of concept in all of this. And it's going to take many years before it finds its way fully into the mainstream of what we want to be that lens that I was talking about earlier.
Thanks, Danny.
Thanks, Ashley.
There's a question or a comment from Tara. Focusing on a person's skills and abilities and how they are the best person to fill a position with a business rather than focusing on what they have challenges with is most beneficial. So focusing more on the skills and the strengths and the abilities of someone, not on what the challenges and that they might have. MJ, you'd like to make a comment using the ASL interpreter? I'll turn her on. Actually, I don't know if I can. Can you turn her on, turn the mic on for Ashley?
I think you just need the voice on for the interpreter. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
So I'm not sure if anyone had read the comments that we're passing along, but I think somebody else was before me. So I think Tara was supposed to make a comment before me in the chat box and then me. So I just wanted to add a comment related to their comment. So if they wanted to go first.
No, I read Tara's comment out. So you're up next, MJ. Go ahead. Thanks.
Oh, okay, sorry. So in regards to Tara's comment, I mean, what she was saying is sort of the same thing that I was thinking about as well. I mean, people need to change their perspectives. It's important to, you know, when you ask a person with disabilities, you don't want to be focusing on what they can't do. You want to focus on what they can do. So if they have a mobility issue or an issue with hearing or with sight, you don't really want to focus in on those. You sort of want to remove those, push those to the side, focus on what are you able to do? What are your skill sets? What are your strengths? And then focus on those and figure out how to creatively move forward and how to problem solve any issues that they may have. And I think that's a big part of inclusion, because a lot of people who don't have those issues or disabilities, then they don't know about these things. So it's important to have those first voice people involved. And then that way we're able to sort of move forward with that knowledge. I mean, you have people with disability who have grown up with those disabilities, and they're much easier are much more readily able to problem solve for those issues. So, I mean, I have done education presentations to many employers sort of around in regards to hearing loss and deafness at a lot of different sort of organizations. And I think after that, they realized, you know, what they aren't aware of because they haven't experienced a person with that disability in the workplace. And a lot of the bosses in the workplaces are all have similarly thoughts and experiences.
Thanks, MJ. Any comments on that, Danny?
No, I just, I agree completely about it. And it just, I'm not sure what the research would be on this, but just in my personal experiences, when you just go ahead and do it, and, you know, and focus on the activity of inclusion, the nature of an accommodation becomes second nature for us, and you don't, and if you're ever forced to sort of do a cost benefit analysis, in my experience, you barely have to do it, because you know how much value comes from bringing somebody into an organization or into a company to make it more successful.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and a lot of times you know, the cost benefit analysis, a lot of employers already know. And one of the things that I think is good for us to do as a community is to encourage those employers that who are already inclusive and know the benefits to talk about it, pump their chest a little bit, be proud. Like that peer-to-peer conversation within the business community has a lot of weight, a lot of value to it. It can have a larger impact than sometimes me as a service provider coming in, because you can be looked at like, well, you're supposed to say that. But if I have somebody from Sobeys talking to somebody for Loblaws, it will have a different type of impact and be perceived differently. Okay. Any more questions or comments? I don't see any, so I think if there's no more, I'd just like to thank Danny for his talk and the discussion. I felt like there was a lot more we could unpack and discuss, and I almost wish we could have like a follow-up one with us all to keep going and have this discussion and almost turn it into a little think tank about how we can do things differently and move in a different and better direction, given how we've just gone through COVID, and we're all agreeing that yes, this is the time and we need to look at things differently and be better. So Danny, thanks for your presentation. You want to give your website? I didn't write it down, but do you want to give your website one more time so people can go check it out?
Yeah, it's Engage Nova Scotia, all one word, .ca.
Engage Nova Scotia, all one word, .ca. Cool.
.ca, and yeah.
Sorry, for the interpreters, is that Nova Scotia just NS or full spelled out Nova Scotia? Full
spelled out Nova Scotia. So all spelled out, Engage Nova Scotia.ca, and I'll just type my my email in the chat box so that you have it, rather than go back up to the top of the material there. Just make sure that I don't mistype it again. So that's where I can be reached, and other members of our team. So look forward to any ideas or further considerations. And I want to say thanks, Marcus, to you and to Ashley and others who helped organize this. And I want to wish everyone well as we work our way through this, and commend you on your commitment to something that is right in the sweet spot of the specifics of what we are trying to more generally drive toward. a more inclusive society where people can live out their potential. And for those people who aren't as challenged to, in a sense, awaken to the realization that life will be better for them, in fact, when we reach this level of inclusivity.
Thank you, Danny.
Yes, and one last comment, because I think it's a good way to finish, because I agree. Thank you so much. Life is a team game is such a great sentiment. It allows a refreshing perspective that others can hold on to. So,
Couldn't agree more.
thank you, Leslie, for that. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks. All the best.
Bye.